This evening, we would like to discuss an extraordinary figure, an cryptic figure, one regarding whom there is undoubtedly much to be said, and that is Jethro. But before we consider what takes place in Exodus chapter 18, where Jethro is not merely a side character, but the main character, a kind of general observation of the difficulty we face broadly in considering Jethro and what he signifies. And that is, as I indicated in the title, the role of the stranger. Because on the one hand, the Torah presents to us a religion, and as a religion, it is undoubtedly open equivalently to all who come to adhere to it. But of course, on the other hand, the Torah, in its establishing, as we've discussed in the past, a covenantal community, in its directing its message at a nation as a nation, implies, in some sense, a closed group, which of course inevitably presents to us a challenge. What is our attitude with respect to the stranger? Of course, as undoubtedly everyone is aware, on the one hand, the fact that there is a nation to which the Torah is directed under no circumstances indicates the exclusivity of the Torah's message. And to that extent, others are certainly welcome to join the nation of Israel. And this is, of course, something that we've discussed in a number of other contexts as well. But of course, on the other hand, there is no call to demand that of the nations of the world. First and foremost, there is no such call because inasmuch as the binding, obligatory nature of the Torah is predicated upon the obligation that is posed upon Israel by its history, it simply doesn't obligate anyone else. Furthermore, as we've noted, inasmuch as the Torah presumes an audience for whom the reality of the Exodus, and indeed the reality of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, is on some plane beyond dispute, it would be unfair to demand fidelity to the Torah of others who are not party to that history or to that historical experience. So again, on the one hand, the door is left open for strangers, but there is no active solicitation of such strangers becoming part of Israel. As we've discussed, from the perspective of the Torah, and this is indeed the accepted perspective in Judaism today, all members of the nations of the world can attain personal salvation and themselves contribute to both their own redemption and the redemption of the world without becoming part of Israel by subscribing to the 7 Noahide laws that represent the essential code of morality that is binding on all of humanity and does not presume in any way the sort of historical experiences that are predicated upon the history of Israel. And of course, to that extent then, our hope, our belief, our conviction with respect to the future, as expressed in Isaiah, is, as we've noted on a number of occasions in the past, that in the end of days, the mountain of the house of God will be set at the head of mountains and uplifted above all hills, and all the nations will stream to it. And they stream as the nations, not as Israel. There isn't any necessity for them to become Israel in order to come there and in order to be party to that glorious day, the ultimate deliverance of all of humanity and the entire world. So that, of course, I'm stating is a kind of general introduction on the subject of strangers. And with that, we launch directly into chapter 18 and consider the singular individual who, in a very real sense, becomes archetypal of the stranger, the blessed stranger, coming home to God. So we read then at the beginning of chapter 18, and of course with this we commence our study. Now Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard of all that God had done for Moses and for Israel, his people, how the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. And Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took Zipporah, Moses' wife, after he had sent her away, and her two sons, of whom the name of the one was Gershom, for he said, I have been a stranger in a strange land. And the name of the other was Eliezer, for the God of my father was my help and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. And, of course, with these introductory verses, the story of Jethro's encounter with Israel begins. But, of course, before we can get to the details of that encounter, we need to grapple with a number of textual difficulties. Yes, textual difficulties once again. Because inevitably, as you know very well, it is through the textual difficulties that we indeed have the opportunity to come face to face with God's Word. Not our expectations of God's Word, but God's Word. In attempting to understand what indeed the text is telling us. And as such, there are, at the outset, three problems that I'd like us to consider. The first goes back to, well, it's the second word in the Hebrew text. It's also actually the second word in the English translation, Jethro. The name of this priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law. Now, mind you, this is not the first place in Scripture where we have encountered Jethro's name as Jethro. Problem is, we've also encountered it not as Jethro, and that will be common enough in the forthcoming as well. First, let's consider our initial encounter with Moses' father-in-law. In chapter 2, verse 16, he is first introduced, and tantalizingly, he isn't even introduced with any name at all, simply as the priest of Midian. We might well ask what that means, being priest of Midian. That's a good question, too. Does it mean that he was a pagan priest? Does it mean, as implied in Genesis in the story of Melchizedek, king of Shalem, that he was a priest to the supreme God, that he was a priest of God? Does it mean, perhaps, that he wasn't a priest in a religious sense at all? Because the Hebrew, Kohen, can in fact refer not only to a priest, but also to a prince, to a leader among the people. In any case, no name so far. Then we get to verse 18, and finally we get to the name. The only thing is, the name is not Jethro. The name is Reuel. Reuel we could translate as friend or companion of God, but of course that would necessarily presume that we are to relate to the name as a Hebrew name and translate it based upon the meaning of the name in Hebrew, which of course is not necessarily the case. In any case, that's the name, Reuel. It's interesting to note that 3 verses later, rather conspicuously, after the priest of Midian invites Moses into his house, we read, and Moses was content to dwell with the man. You'd expect a name here. And the text is deliberately reticent, leaving out his name. Well, I already told you that this is still not to be construed as implying that the name Jethro only appears in Exodus chapter 18. It appears in chapter 3. Now, chapter 3, verse 1, which is the debut of Jethro's name, is of course a very significant verse because it describes Moses keeping the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, priest of Midian, still described priest of Midian, leading the flock to the farthest end of the wilderness, coming to the mountain of God, to Chorev. This verse, of course, serves as the prelude for the description of Moses' encounter with the burning bush. After that encounter is complete, chapter 4, verse 18, Moses returned to his father-in-law. Now, I don't know about the translation that you're using, but much to my consternation, the translation that we're using over here, which comes from 1917, renders the name of Moses' father-in-law at the beginning of this verse as Jethro. Well, that is not what the Hebrew original tells us. The Hebrew original tells us Jether, not Jethro. A different name, a name that has only 3 letters instead of 4 in the Hebrew. What makes this all the more tantalizing is not only have we already encountered the name Jethro, again, beginning of chapter 3, we encounter the name Jethro again in the same verse. That is, Moses returned to Jethro, his father-in-law, asking for permission to return to Egypt. And it is Jethro, not Jethro, who says to Moses, go in, or perhaps more rigorously, toward peace, and sends him on his way. So, if you're keeping count, at this point, in addition to the unqualified priest of Midian without a name being cited, we have encountered 3 names, Reuel, Jethro, and Jether. In Numbers chapter 10, we encounter yet, ostensibly, a 4th name. Well, at least another name, whether it's another name of Jethro, remains somewhat enigmatic. Chovav. That is what we read in Numbers chapter 10. Moses said to Chovav, the son of Reuel the Midianite, Moses' father-in-law. What remains unclarified is Moses' father-in-law. Is Moses' father-in-law Reuel, or is Moses' father-in-law Chovav? Not entirely clear. And in any case, the content of the statement is, we are journeying unto the place of which God said, I will give it to you. Come with us, and we will do you good, because God has spoken good concerning Israel. And the response of Chovav, son of Reuel the Midianite, Moses' father-in-law, is, I will not go, but I will depart to my own land and to my own kindred. What is particularly fascinating, indeed tantalizing, in this passage in Numbers chapter 10 is that part about departing to his own land. Wait, doesn't that sound familiar? That's precisely the way chapter 18 concludes. And Moses let his father-in-law depart, or perhaps better rendered as sent his father-in-law off, and he went his way to his own land. Almost the self-same expression, except, of course, in this case, in third person rather than in first person. Which raises a tantalizing additional question. This, problem number 2 in Exodus chapter 18. When did it happen? When we read of the departure of Moses' father-in-law for his own land, are we reading about 2 departures? One in Exodus chapter 18 and the other in Numbers chapter 10? Or are these 2 different portrayals of the same event? Pay attention to what we read shortly after the statement of departure in Numbers chapter 10, this in verse 33. And they set forward from the mount of the Lord, 3 days' journey. So what is described in Numbers chapter 10 takes place at the mount of the Lord. Well, that's very interesting because, of course, when we consider the circumstances of Jethro's arrival, back to Exodus chapter 18, verse 5, we read, and Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came with his sons and his wife unto Moses into the wilderness where he was encamped at the Mount of God. Mount of God. Sounds like the same location from which Chavav, son of Reuel, the Midianite, Moses' father-in-law, was departing in Numbers chapter 10. And we should note that this is not the first time that we encountered the Mount of God in Scripture either. This also helps to satisfy our curiosity as to just which mountain this is. Remember chapter 3, verse 1? Moses was keeping the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the farthest end of the wilderness and came to the mountain of God. The mountain of God is none other than Crave, which is, we should note, another one of the names of a mountain known far more commonly as Sinai. But this inevitably raises an additional difficulty in our understanding the chronology of events and in our determining altogether when it was that Jethro came. When, then, the narrative in Exodus chapter 18 took place. Because, as you may have already noted, this is chapter 19. In fact, it is immediately after what we read at the end of chapter 18 that Moses sent off his father-in-law, who then returned to his land. But that departure, if we are to equate it with what we read in Numbers chapter 10, manifestly should have been from the mountain of God that they had not yet reached. But if they hadn't yet come to the mountain of God, then what is it that we are reading in verse 5? That Jethro, with Moses' sons and wife, came to him where he was encamped at the Mount of God. Just to make sure this point is clear. Again, chapter 18 tells us Jethro was coming to the mountain of God. At the end of chapter 18, he leaves. We're not told where he left from. But in Numbers chapter 10, we are told that Moses' father-in-law left from the mountain of God. But in Exodus chapter 18, we haven't yet been told that Israel has come to the mountain of God. Rather, what we are told in Exodus chapter 19 is, in the third month after the children of Israel were gone forth out of the land of Egypt, the same day came they into the wilderness of Sinai. And when they were departed from Rephidim and were come to the wilderness of Sinai, they encamped in the wilderness, and there Israel encamped before, or opposite, the mount. Which mountain? Mount Sinai. And indeed, we ought to note here that in Exodus chapter 24, following the revelation at Sinai, God says to Moses, "Come up to me into the mount and be there, and I will give you the tablets of stone, the law," or teaching, more precisely, as we've noted, that's what Torah is, "the commandment which I have written, that you may teach them." Which mountain was this? Well, text states explicitly in Exodus chapter 24, Moses rose up, and Joshua, his attendant servant, and Moses went up into the mount of God. So the narrative that begins to unfold in chapter 19, verse 1, when the nation comes to the wilderness of Sinai, is in fact the nation coming to the mountain of God. But I'm still going to reiterate. Jethro had already come to the mount of God in Exodus chapter 18. We have a problem, don't we? I'll add an additional consideration that further complicates our chronology of Exodus chapter 18 with chapter 19. Namely, in Exodus chapter 18, after the initial welcoming of Jethro, we read what happened the next day. It came to pass on the morrow that Moses sat to judge the people, and the people stood about Moses from the morning until the evening. Why were they standing there? Well, it's a good question. Jethro wants to know as well. And Moses' answer in verse 15, "Because the people come unto me to inquire of God. When they have a matter, it comes to me, and I judge between a man and his neighbor, and I make them know the statutes of God and his laws." Note, inquiring of God, making known the statutes of God and his laws. Well, don't these endeavors presume that the divine revelation has already taken place? And that's why, in the wake of that revelation at Sinai, the people come to inquire of God. And that's why, when I need to judge them, I make them know the statutes of God and his laws, because they were already revealed. So now when we consider the evidence, number one, that in Exodus chapter 18, Jethro is explicitly described as coming to the mountain of God. Number two, in Numbers chapter 10, Moses' father-in-law, by whatever name, is described as departing before the nation had left the mountain of God. Number three, while he's there, Moses is judging the people based upon the statutes of God and his laws that were presumably revealed at the mountain of God. All of these considerations that, it would seem, guide us to conclude that Exodus chapter 18 happens after the nation has come to the mountain of God. which is another way of saying that Exodus chapter 18 happens after Exodus chapter 19, at least after the beginning of chapter 19. Probably after the whole thing, considering that, read through Exodus chapter 19. Moses has a very, very busy schedule in Exodus chapter 19. It doesn't seem too likely that after coming to Sinai, to the mountain of God, the events of Exodus 18 could have taken place prior to the revelation at Sinai. So what does this mean then? Is the chronology of the Torah called into question? Our answer to this question is the chronology of the Torah is certainly not going to be called into question from here alone. The chronology of the Torah is called into question from a lot of other passages as well. So much so, in fact, that we have a general principle, an ancient principle in our tradition. There is no chronology in the Torah. You want proof? I'll give you proof. There are a lot of passages that can be cited, but perhaps one of the more obvious. Consider these two citations. The first from Numbers chapter 1, indeed, the opening verses of the book of Numbers. The second from Numbers chapter 9. In Numbers chapter 1, we read of what God says to Moses on the first day of the second month, in the second year after they were come out of the land of Egypt. Okay. 8 chapters later, chapter 9. How much time do you think has elapsed from chapter 1, verse 1, which was taking place, again, first day of the second month? In chapter 9, we read about God speaking to Moses in the first month of the second year. So how much time elapsed in the interim? 8 chapters, minus 1 month. 6 months earlier than it had been 8 chapters before. So clearly, indeed, chronology is not the determinant of what is written in the Torah. I hope no one is alarmed by this. This should come, based upon what we've discussed previously, as no surprise at all. Because as we've noted, the word Torah means teaching, and it isn't teaching us history. It's teaching us how to live. It's teaching us right and wrong, teaching us ideals and values. Inasmuch as those are the priorities, historical chronology is not. Now, mind you, that doesn't mean that the Torah is disorganized. God forbid. If anything, it means precisely the opposite. The Torah is exquisitely organized in the best way possible to teach us. It is teaching. But appreciating as we do that what it's teaching is not history, the dictates of historical chronology are simply going to have to be subordinated to the Torah's agenda in teaching us what it wishes to teach us. Of course, concluding this places upon us a special burden, a responsibility in Exodus chapter 18. If we understand Exodus chapter 18 as taking place chronologically, and by the way, I should concede that we could, because there are possible answers to all the questions that I raised. But it seems more exciting to consider this possibility in any case, because if the chapter is chronological, then were I to ask you, why is it placed where it is placed? You might simply respond, it's placed there because that's when it happened. That could work if the chronology is preserved. If it isn't, then it certainly isn't going to be adequate. Then you need to discern in what takes place in the neighborhood, before, after, during, some justification for why the story of Jethro is deliberately placed here. Because according to this approach, it was placed here deliberately out of order. It wasn't placed here deliberately out of order to confuse us. It was placed here deliberately out of order to teach us. Again, with the realization that what the Torah is intent upon teaching us is not history, not chronology, but teaching. So, of course, inevitably, part of our responsibility will be figuring out what it's teaching and why it's teaching it specifically here. This, I remind you, was our second problem with the narrative here. That is, the first was all the names. Second, when did it happen altogether? Third, what's going on with Sipporah, Moses' wife? That is, just consider verse 2. Verse 2 almost reads like an internal contradiction. Jethro refers to Sipporah as Moses' wife, and then as having been sent away. Now, this, of course, is the Torah narrating, in describing her as the wife and as having been sent away. In context, being sent away carries the connotation of divorce. But Jethro himself refers to Sipporah coming with him into the wilderness as your wife. So what happened? Wife or divorcee? And if wife, then why indeed wasn't she at Moses' side through all of the events that had just been taking place? Why was she at home with Dad in Midian? So with respect to this last question, I'd like to begin an ancient answer to the question pertaining to what we read in Exodus chapter 4. In Exodus chapter 4, we already saw Moses solicits from Jethro permission to leave to return to Egypt. And 2 verses later, Moses took his wife and sons, set them upon an ass, and returned to the land of Egypt. Moses took the rod of God in his hand, and God says to Aaron, go to meet Moses. They meet in the mountain of God. Can't help but note here, this is the second place in Scripture that we encounter reference to the mountain of God. The first was Exodus chapter 3, verse 1, when Moses comes there and experiences the burning bush. The third is when Jethro comes there, beginning of chapter 18. Okay, so Moses and Aaron meet at the mountain of God. Verse 28, Moses told Aaron all the words of God wherewith he had sent him, and all the signs wherewith he had charged him. And finally, verse 29, Moses and Aaron went and gathered together all the elders of the children of Israel. Something bother you about these verses? Bothers me. Isn't something missing here? Moses was journeying with his wife and sons. All of a sudden, after the encounter with Aaron, we only read about Moses and Aaron. What happened to his wife and sons? The text is deliberately silent, doesn't tell us. But we do actually have a tradition that supplements the dialogue. That when Aaron met Moses, he looks over Moses' shoulder, and of course, he sees Sipporah and Gershom and Eliezer, Moses' wife and sons. And he asks Moses, "Who are these?" And Moses introduces his wife and sons to Aaron. Whereupon Aaron says to Moses, "You know, we have so much grief over everyone who is in Egypt now. You want to bring more people to Egypt for more grief? Everyone's suffering in Egypt. Why in the world would we want to expose them to that?" And so Moses turns to Tzipporah and says, "I think you should go back to your father's house." He did send her away, but it's not like he severed a bond with her. It wasn't divorce in that sense of the term. It was, let's say, an expression of the challenge that from time immemorial has faced all great leaders. How to juggle responsibilities to family with responsibilities to one's mission, to those whom one is leading. And so indeed, in the interim, the solution is for Sipporah and Moses' sons to go back to Jethro. They return here to the mountain of God. And of course, it is in that vein then that we consider what takes place when Jethro brings them back, in particular. What takes place to Jethro when he brings them back. In considering the events that are unfolding in Exodus chapter 18, and in that vein, in particular, to consider, number one, why all the names? Number two, why is it recorded here? We inevitably return to the text of Exodus chapter 18 and consider in particular, again, what we read in verse 5. Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came with his sons and his wife to Moses into the wilderness where he was encamped at the Mount of God. The placement of where he was encamped at the Mount of God at the end of the verse calls our attention specifically to that as the destination. Moreover, it is Jethro journeying from his home into the wilderness, leaving everything behind. This is inevitably not merely a family reunion. It is, for Jethro, a spiritual pilgrimage. And indeed, Moses sees it in that vein likewise. Moses goes to greet his father-in-law, and after the greetings, they come into the tent, and what Moses then goes on to describe to his father-in-law is everything that God has done to Pharaoh, the Egyptians, for Israel's sake, and all the travail that had come upon them by the way, and how God delivered them. This is not merely an academic record. This is a recounting of experiencing God. And Jethro reads the message loud and clear. And Jethro rejoiced for all the goodness that God had done to Israel, in that he had delivered them out of the hand of the Egyptians. Consider what an extraordinary act verse 9 describes. That Jethro rejoiced. Jethro, coming not from Israel, coming from a nation that had generally amicable relationships with Egypt. Indeed, it was in that vein that his daughters identified Moses as an Egyptian who saved us from the shepherds. And Jethro hears of what God has wrought to Egypt, and he rejoices because divine justice is manifest in meting out punishment to the wicked. And moreover, Jethro said, verse 10, "Blessed be God, who has delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians and out of the hand of Pharaoh, who has delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Blessed be God." What is so extraordinary about this statement is, until Jethro stated this, no one else in all the Bible has ever yet used the expression, "Blessed be God." Indeed, I'll note that in our tradition we learn from the example of Jethro that when one experiences a miracle, one should utter a blessing. Because Jethro, vicariously experiencing the miracle of the exodus from Egypt and the redemption, utters a blessing. Blessed be God. That is indeed manifestly part of what the Torah is telling us about Jethro. Perhaps it's even a thinly veiled chastisement of Israel that Israel needed to get the push from the stranger who was saying, "Blessed be God," because they hadn't said it themselves. There's an additional dimension that perhaps helps us to understand why indeed it is uniquely Jethro who has the wherewithal to say this. In verse 11, "Now I know that God is greater than all gods." Now I know. Now I know because, unlike you folks, I tried them all out. The implication being that when Jethro is described initially as a priest of Midian, he was a pagan priest. And indeed, we have a tradition that Jethro didn't leave any form of idolatry behind. He experimented with every single one. So that while priest can mean priest of God and priest of idolatry, pagan priest, Jethro may have actually succeeded in being both. He starts out his career in paganism. He experiences firsthand everything to be experienced in the outside world in the most pejorative, bankrupt sense imaginable. But for him, that is means not to depravity, but rather to blessing God. To the appreciation that after having seen it all, done it all, gone everywhere, there is indeed none like God. I know that God is greater than all forces in the world because I've experienced them all. And to the extent then that he has the wherewithal to say that, he has the wherewithal to bless God to a degree that someone who comes from within may indeed lack. But the realization is not merely verbal, it is also one that impels him to action. And that's verse 12. Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took a burnt offering and sacrifices for God. The bringing of sacrifices, of offerings, of course, on the one hand, represents consecrating one's own property to God. Beyond that, it also signifies that I am accepting God's sovereignty over myself. And I am committing myself to serve God, not only in words, but in deed. That's what Jethro is doing here. That's not all that Jethro is doing, however. Recall again the second part of the chapter, when Jethro sees the way Moses is judging the people, and Jethro says, "You're not doing it right. Hearken now unto my voice, I will give you counsel, and God be with you." And that's what happens. Moses hearkened to the voice of his father-in-law and did all that he had said. That is, so far as Moses is concerned, so far as Israel is concerned, there are indeed crucial lessons that need to be learned from Jethro, that need to be learned from outside. And of course, this theme becomes a very obvious one in what then follows in the description of the encounter of Moses' father-in-law with the nation of Israel in Numbers chapter 10. When Moses says to Chovab, son of Reuel, the Midianites, his father-in-law, "We are journeying to the place of which God said, I will give it to you. Come with us, and we will do you good, for God has spoken good concerning Israel." On the one hand, that is the blessing of the stranger. That the stranger, coming from afar, joining with Israel, becomes party to the good that God bestows upon his servants. Initially, however, he demurs. "I will not go, but I will depart to my own land and to my kindred." And then Moses continues, "Leave us not, I pray you, for as much as you know how we are to encamp in the wilderness. And you will be to us," could be read as instead of eyes, or perhaps better as our guide. You will be our guide. You will be our guide? What about Moses? He can't be the guide. What about God? The pillar of cloud by day and pillar of fire by night. We need Jethro? And on some plane, inevitably, the answer is yes. That is, there is that dimension of guidance that comes specifically from someone who knows everything on the outside, that only he can bestow. It's not just blessing that he is being blessed by becoming part of Israel. It is the blessing that he conveys to Israel by becoming part of them. I must admit that I chose the title, "The Blessing of the Stranger," as a double entendre. That is, the blessing that comes to the stranger and the blessing bestowed by the stranger. And so after stating that you know how we are to encamp in the wilderness, you will be our guide. Moses says, "And it shall be, if you will go with us, then what good God does unto us, the same will we do unto you." In other words, inevitably, it will be a reciprocal relationship, the bestowal of blessing by Israel and Jethro, and on Israel by Jethro. Both the blessing of the stranger. This blessing because what we read with respect to Jethro's story and what takes place in Exodus chapter 18 in particular is that Jethro is transformed. And inevitably, as such, we also recognize why all the names. Because when someone is transformed, his name changes, his identity changes. Just consider the example of Abraham. Genesis chapter 17. Abraham fell on his face, And God talked with him, saying, As for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you will be a father of a multitude of nations. Neither shall your name anymore be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham. For the father of a multitude of nations have I made you. And I did that, mind you, by adding a letter to your name. Remember, back in Exodus chapter 4, when we saw that Moses returned to Jethro. In the same verse, he's also Jethro. And it is specifically Jethro who is sending Moses on his way. Jethro, deficient spelling, becomes Jethro with the extra letter because he is sending Moses on his way. It's also a transformative act. And the various names, Chovav. Chovav means lover, companion, which after all, Jethro becomes the God, the Uel, friend of God. Same idea. The realization that indeed what takes place in Jethro's life is transformational. Rare indeed is it that we have the opportunity to, as it were, be born anew. That's what takes place in the life and times of Jethro, coming as the stranger, and indeed being transformed. But there's an additional nuance that I think we should consider, and it manifestly comes to the fore when we consider the example of Abraham. Abraham getting an additional letter in his name is not merely one who is transformed. It is one who, having already transformed himself through his deeds, is assigned a new role, a new mission, to be an archetype, to be the father of a multitude of nations. Isn't that what's happening to Jethro as well? He's also becoming an archetype for strangers, coming from afar, coming as a blessing, with their blessing, and receiving reciprocally their blessing through their encounter with Israel. For that, Jethro gets another letter in his name. And this consideration inevitably brings us to our last major question, which is, why the placement here? In particular, in the event that we don't understand the placement in Exodus chapter 18 as being chronological. Well, if it's not chronological, then it was deliberately inserted after Exodus chapter 17. In the second half of Exodus chapter 17, we read about another encounter with foreigners, with strangers. But this one is not pretty. This is the encounter with Amalek. Then came Amalek and fought with Israel in Rephidim, an unprovoked attack, which, of course, in our tradition is emblematic specifically of the role of Amalek in attempting to negate the divine mission with which God vests Israel. And so it is an unprovoked attack. And Israel responds. Moses designates Joshua to choose men and go out and fight with Amalek. And Joshua does so, and he weakens, breaks the ranks of Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. And what then follows? This is of utmost importance. And God said to Moses, write this for a memorial in the book and rehearse it in the ears of Joshua, for I will utterly blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. And Moses built an altar, calls it in God's name, and he says, the hand upon the throne of God. God will have a war with Amalek for all generations. Amalek too came as a stranger to fight, a stranger to destroy, a stranger to negate the blessing and negate the mission. It's significant to note that the victory over Amalek is not instantaneous. Rather, God will have a war with Amalek for all generations. Why? Obviously, if God so chose, he could have obliterated Amalek immediately. Yes, but Jethro is not the only one who is playing an archetypal role here. Jethro is archetypal for the stranger, again, coming from afar with his blessings to bestow upon Israel, to become blessed himself through Israel. Amalek is also archetypal. The unprovoked attack. The deliberate agenda to defuse the divine mission that God vests his people with achieving. And to the extent that that too is an archetypal role, so long as this world continues, there is indeed an ongoing war with Amalek for all generations. You can't eradicate that by obliterating the Amalekite nation. For all intents and purposes, the nation of Amalek is already as good as gone. We have no idea who may have hailed from that nation. The nation has certainly long ago ceased to exist as one that has any identifiable attributes, at least not genealogical ones. No, the attributes of Amalek, the sine qua non of Amalek, is ideological. And therefore, for all generations, those who likewise come unprovoked. Not so much to fight God's people as to fight God through his people. Those people who wage war in this vein are Amalek. Not necessarily by genealogy, not necessarily by parentage. That's irrelevant. They are Amalek. Amalek is archetypal. And as a result, God will have war with Amalek for all generations. That, then, becomes the eternal legacy of Amalek. And what about the legacy of Jethro? Is there a legacy of Jethro? Evidently, what took place in Numbers chapter 10 was not Jethro leaving and never coming back. In Judges chapter 1, verse 16, the children of the Canaanite, Moses' father-in-law, went up out of the city of palm trees with the children of Judah into the wilderness of Judah, which is south of Arad, and they went and dwelt with the people. That is, the descendants of Jethro, of Moses' father-in-law, are dwelling together with Judah, dwelling together with the people. They are archetypal, and they are coming home. In Judges chapter 1, the relationship between Judah and the Canaanites, the descendants of Jethro, is somewhat murky. In Judges chapter 4, it is much better clarified, albeit with a certain element of ambiguity. Because on the one hand, now Heber the Canaanite had severed himself, or had separated from the Canaanites, from the children of Chavav, the father-in-law of Moses, and had pitched his tent as far as Elon B'Tza'ananim, which is by Kedesh. So, these descendants of Moses' father-in-law are a well-defined ethnic grouping, but what we read about them in Judges chapter 4 is, in verse 17, there was peace between Yavin, king of Chatzar, and the house of Heber the Canaanite. Now, Yavin, king of Chatzar, was doing battle with Israel, but he had a peace treaty with the Canaanites. Does that mean they were on the other side? Of course, what ensues in chapter 4 is the grisly tale of how Yael, the wife of Heber the Canaanite, is the instrument of dispatching the chief of staff of Yavin, killing him. That killing of Sisra, Yavin's chief of staff, is the means through which, as we read in verse 23, God subdued on that day Yavin, the king of Canaan, before the children of Israel. And it's thanks to Yael, wife of Heber HaKeni. Indeed, it is in this vein that Deborah extols her in her song in Judges chapter 5. Blessed above women shall Yael be, the wife of Heber the Canaanite. Above women in the tent shall she be blessed. Rather heady accolades. We have a tradition that above women in the tent means she is to be blessed more than Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, the holy mothers who dwelled in the tents. Yael signifies the future of Heber HaKeni, the future of the descendants of Yael. But we're not finished yet. Tantalizing in particular it is to consider that we encounter the juxtaposition of the Canaanites with Amalek, not only in Exodus chapters 17 and 18, but also in Samuel 1, chapter 15, specifically, when God sends Samuel to direct King Saul to wreak out God's vengeance against Amalek. I remember that which Amalek did to Israel, how he set himself against him in the way when he came out of Egypt. Now go and smite Amalek. King Saul has a debt that he is obliged to pay. And Saul said to the Canaanites, go, depart, get you down from among the Amalekites, lest I destroy you with them. For you showed kindness to all the children of Israel when they came up out of Egypt. In other words, there's juxtaposition between Amalek and the descendants of Yethro, just as there had been a juxtaposition between them in Exodus chapter 17 and chapter 18. But of course, the message in that juxtaposition is precisely Amalek chose to be an archetype of one sort. You chose to be an archetype of a very different sort. You showed kindness to all the children of Israel when they came up out of Egypt. That kindness, that gift of Jethro coming to Israel and showing them the way. Jethro is the archetype of the blessing of the stranger. Amalek, the archetype of the curse. There is one final additional narrative in the prophets that also, in a way, presents us with a juxtaposition between the Canaanites and Amalek. This is particularly instructive considering that in the time of King Saul, the Canaanites dwelt with Amalek. Less than a generation later, in Samuel 1, chapter 30, we read of David's doing battle with Amalek that had just despoiled the cities of Judah. And after vanquishing Amalek and repossessing all of the spoils, when David came to Ziklag, he sent of the spoil to the elders of Judah, even to his friends, saying, "Behold, the present for you of the spoil of the enemies of the Lord." Which enemies of the Lord? Well, in context, it's unambiguous. Those enemies are Amalek. And then there's a list of all of the locales that were the beneficiaries of these gifts. Last on the list, actually, is Hebron, where King David had lived and would first reign before reigning in Jerusalem. Earlier on in the list, he also sent gifts to the cities of the Canaanites. In the context here, the Canaanites are mentioned together with these various cities of Judah as just one of them, having become so completely integrated into the rest of Judah that in some sense they were inseparable. That too is part of the archetypal role of Jethro and his descendants, the blessing of the stranger. This would be all, except there's an additional dimension that is admittedly less explicit, but more far-reaching. In Numbers chapter 24, we read of the parable of Bil'am. The last thing he has to say before departing from Balak, son of Moab. And he tells him what he sees in the world of the future. I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not nigh. There shall step forth a star out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel, and shall crush the corners of Moab, and uproot, dominate all the sons of Seth. And Edom will be a possession. Seir also, even his enemies, will be a possession, while Israel does valiantly. And out of Jacob shall one have dominion, and shall destroy the remnants from the city. A description, I hope it is clear to us, of the final battles of the Messiah, the end of days, the redemption of the world. And in that context, he continues, and he looked on Amalek and took up his parable and said, Amalek was the first of nations, but his end will be everlasting destruction, as we, of course, already saw. But look who the next focus of Bil'am addresses. And he looked on the Canaanite and took up his parable and said, there are different translations of what follows. We follow the traditional interpretation of these verses, that he said, powerful is your dwelling place, and set in a cliff your nest. That is, you really are dwelling securely. Because even when the time comes to destroy the Canaanites, it's not really going to be destruction. Until where will Assyria hold you in captivity? It'll just be something temporary. And you will return with the return of the exiles. You are forever. With respect to the rest of the nations, alas, who shall live after God has appointed them, after God's devastation? but the Canaanites will. Just as Amalek, archetypal stranger who comes to destroy, receives as his recompense a war with God for all generations. Jethro. And the Canaanites descended from him, received from God eternal reward. There is just one additional nuance that we need to consider in appreciating the scope of this reward. This pertains to an obscure verse in Chronicles, where we read in chapter 2, and the families of scribes that dwelt at Yavetz, the Terathites, the Shemiathites, and the Sukkothites, these are the Canaanites. Well, we already know who the Canaanites are, don't we? That came of Hamat, father of the house of Rechav. The house of Rechav, remember that, is associated here with the Canaanites. And the Canaanites, we know, are the family of Jethro. Yavetz, who is mentioned near the beginning of the verse, is mentioned twice afterward in chapter 4 in Chronicles. Yavetz was more honorable than his brethren. He called on the God of Israel, asking for success and deliverance from evil, and his supplication in our tradition is seen as entirely spiritual, and God granted him what he requested. So, Yavetz, with his spiritual requests to teach and disseminate God's teachings, teaches the Canaanites, the descendants of Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, the house of Rechav. And regarding that house of Rechav, there is an extraordinary prophecy dedicated exclusively to them in Jeremiah chapter 35. The word which came upon Jeremiah from God in the days of Joachim, the son of Yoshia, king of Judah, saying, "Go unto the house of the Rechavites, the Rechavim, and speak of them, and bring them into the house of God, into one of the chambers, and give them wine to drink." Wine? Why is it so important to give them wine to drink? We continue. Then I took the members of the house of the Rechabites, and I set before the sons of the house goblets full of wine and cups, and I said to them, "Drink the wine." And they said, "We will drink no wine, because Yonadav, the son of Rechav, our father, commanded us, saying, You shall drink no wine, neither you nor your sons forever, neither shall you build a house, nor sow seed, nor plant vineyard, nor have any, but all your days you shall dwell in tents, that you may live many days in the land wherein you sojourn. And he continues, we have hearkened to the voice of Yonatan, son of Rechav, our father, in all that he charged us, to drink no wine all our days, we, our wives, our sons, and our daughters, nor to build houses for us to dwell in, neither to have vineyard or field or seed. But we have dwelt in tents and have hearkened and done according to all that Yonadav, our father, commanded us. These are the actions of Yonadav ben Rechav and his family. A recoil against the moral degradation that was taking place in northern Israel. They were part of the nation at this point. Part, but continued to live apart. And so, as they dwell apart, there is a specially designated prophecy in Jeremiah for the house of Rechav, the descendants of Jethro. And unto the house of the Rechavites, Jeremiah said, thus says the God of hosts, the God of Israel, because you have hearkened to the commandment of Yonadav your father, and kept all his precepts, and done according to all that he commanded you. Therefore, thus says the God of hosts, the God of Israel, there shall not be cut off unto Yonadav, the son of Rechav, a man to stand before me forever. The eve of destruction, the eve of the Babylonian exile, the Rechavites will endure. There shall not be cut off unto Yonadav, the son of Rechav, a man to stand before me forever. We have an ancient tradition that as such, it is the descendants of Yonadav ben Rechav, descended from Jethro, who are the harbingers of the redemption. That when the redemption comes, someone's going to have to tell our holy fathers and holy mothers in Hebron, God has kept his promise. In our tradition, that role is allotted to the household of the Rechavites, the descendants of Jethro. Upon reflection, this of course shouldn't surprise us. We have a number of notable, extraordinary strangers who have become part of Israel in its history. Of course, at the time of the Exodus, in Exodus chapter 12, verse 38, we read of the multitude that accompanied Israel in its Exodus. Besides Jethro, we read, of course, famously in the Bible, the story of Ruth, the Moabite. Ruth, who is the mother of the Davidic dynasty, and thus the mother, many times removed, but nonetheless the mother of the Messiah. The redemption of the world depends upon the stranger. And the herald of that redemption is likewise descended from the stranger, descended from Jethro. Returning to the note with which we began, the role of the stranger in Israel. Both in the Bible and at even greater length, post-biblically, we read of the extraordinary roles fulfilled in history through the strangers. Jethro is the archetype for them all. On the one hand, anchored in chapter 18, because chapter 17 provides a very different kind of archetype. That was the archetype of the one who comes to destroy Israel, Amalek. And as a result, merits, measure for measure, ultimate divine destruction. Chapter 18, the one who comes to bless Israel. And as a result, for all time, is blessed. And of course, inevitably, we consider, where does it lead? It leads to chapter 19, to God's revelation to Israel and the world. Israel is to be charged with being the light of the nations, but sometimes you need a stranger coming from the nations to kindle that light and to make it shine. That too is part of preparation for receiving the Torah. That, then, ultimately is the blessing of the stranger. The blessing of the stranger that the stranger receives. the blessing of the stranger, that the stranger bestows the blessing that ultimately is a blessing for the entire world. God bless you.